Hi friends, it's Kaylee of Moonstruck Creations here. Thanks for joining me on my channel. Today I'm going to give you a better understanding of how to steer into the flow and let it happen, but also how to have a little bit more control of the situation and make it happen in the way that you're wanting it to happen. Personally, I really wish I knew these tricks earlier in my watercolor journey. Definitely would have saved me a lot of headache and heartache. So on that note, let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So we're going to start with a dry brush first. So if our brush is dry and we pick up some paint, see how it doesn't even like transfer over? Like, can you even see that? No, because there's not enough water to carry it and to like spread it onto the bristles of the brush. So you just can't see anything. So obviously if we're getting these white marks underneath our paint, then that means you need more water, okay? So, it looks like if it's too dry, if we get the right amount of paint on that, if we wet our brush down, load up our paintbrush with our paint, then see how it gets kind of dry at the end, because this is a big brush, so it takes quite a bit of water for it to kind of get saturated and satiated. But yeah, so if you have enough and you get a good amount of water on your brush, then see that's what I'm talking about, okay? So that is what that looks like. We want to make sure that we're not going in with too dry of a brush, otherwise we're not going to cover any surface area with our pigment, okay? You can also struggle like if you have a wet brush but your paint isn't woken up. So if you see here, so like that one, my palette is a mess, so pardon my disgrace here. But anyways, so this one I wet down and I got that water in there, so it's kind of mixed to create watercolor paint, right? But if I take the same wet brush, I just got dunked it in my water, and I just go over here to this dry paint. Let's choose another color of blue. So we're not going to work it up too much because we have a wet brush, but dry paint. You see, it picks it up because you have enough water on there, but it doesn't like cover or coat or saturate the area. So we've got like a little bit of an ombre effect going. I'll show you like a contrast of what that looks like now that we've got some water on it and we've woken that paint up a bit. Then we can take that and see how it carries so much further. So that's what we're talking about as far as like loading your brush up properly and getting kind of the right ratios between water and color and brush wetness and all of that. So, okay, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but we're going to be reviewing it using the wet and wet technique. So I do this technique in a lot of my classes. So we're going to see what that looks like. So wet and wet, basically, like all of this was wet on dry because we took wet paint, put it on dry paper. Wet and wet obviously is like one of my favorite things about watercolor because that's where you find the flow. So I love that. But anyways, I'll show you. So wet and wet, if we have, you probably can't really see this. I'll tint it a little bit just so that we can see that bleed. But I'll show you kind of what I mean by wet and wet. So if we have this like wet area, and then we're going to put this different color of blue in here, say. So see how that blends and bleeds and blooms and kind of like has just a good old time there. You can move it around, kind of use gravity to make it do whatever you're wanting it to do. I don't like to try to make it do too much because I just like to watch it bleed, which sounds dark, but you know what I mean. Okay. So, that being said, there's a couple of nuances that I'm finding teaching wet and wet techniques in my classes. So I just wanted to address those and give a little bit of insight onto how to best utilize the wet and wet technique. So, we want to watch how wet you're going into it, like how wet your paper is. So see if I just keep dropping bunches of water on here on my paper. Just gonna get real saturated with the wetness. And then see it kind of starts bubbling up on here. Like if you picked it up, it'd probably drip, but see how it all kind of like bubbles down there. we've got just like a lot of water sitting on top of this paper and it's not going to absorb it fast enough. So if we have something like that and our surface is really wet and it's pooling around these areas and we take our brush loaded up with our pigment of that darker blue color and we drop it in. So where it's not so wet, it kind of looks like this, right? But it kind of stops bleeding really fast. So you can obviously like tap it in there and try to make it bigger, but then it'll do some funky things when you have this puddle of water sitting on top. Also, what it typically can do is kind of often, especially if it's on the side, and it touches this bigger pooling area, it'll just spread into that pooling area. Or if we touch the pooling area, see how it just kind of like sits there, and then it'll kind of slowly start dissipating in that pool that's sitting on there. And it's also really easy to like when you move it, it just like muddles the whole thing. So it can be fun for certain techniques to do it this way. But if you're wanting more control, which this is a water control video, if you're wanting a little bit more, yeah, I mean, it is controlled if you do it like this and it's something that you're intentionally wanting, but like, cause it's pretty fun. Look at that. Kind of cool looking. But if it's not something you're wanting and you're trying to get like controlled bleeds and you want it to just kind of sit on a leopard or whatever, a cheetah, this is not going to be how you want your wet and wet to look, because then it'll also just pool up in those big pool areas, right? All of that pigment will kind of naturally gravitate towards where the liquid is really heavy, okay? So that's one mistake that I see with wet and wet techniques, and that kind of prevent people from achieving the look, their desired outcome. I'm going to show you another one. Because obviously, so we've got too wet. If you have too dry, let's see what that looks like. So we're going to take this and just circle some water on there, whatever's on my brush, okay? So it's pretty dry. Probably hard to see, but you can kind of see it there. So if we go in here, see it's like really, really not going to spread much. So you want to kind of find the right middle ground between being saturated enough for it to bleed, but also not being too saturated, right, with water that it's just pool up. So, and obviously, I shouldn't say obviously because it's not always obvious. Not everyone has been doing this as long as I have. But you can tap in on the same spot and it'll make it bigger. If it's dry, it probably won't get too big. If it's wet, it could, but it'll kind of just bleed all over. Also, if we have like the right level of wetness, see how it'll kind of blend out. It'll stay wet for a while and you can go back in and like tap in even some darker areas to get kind of like a really darkened interest in there. But so much fun. I could just tap in there all day. I'll leave it on though. But yeah, so too wet versus too dry. As far as actually on your paper, there's a couple other things that I did want to address with the wet and wet technique. So say we have like the right level of wetness on our paper prior. So enough to be saturated, but not pooling at the surface where it's going to be irritating for us, okay? So a good way to like look at that is just to see, like look at it from an angle. You get a good, if it's shimmery, like it's shiny. Oh wow, see, yeah, that dripped all the way down the second I lifted it up, which like I've cleaned this up so that blues make me nervous. Okay. Resume. Anywho, if we have the right level of wetness, you can look at the side of your paper and then you can kind of just tell that it's like shimmery and it's wet. If not, you can go back over some of those spots where it isn't wet. Just kind of wet that back up again. If it's too dry, you can take a dry brush or a paper towel or something and lift some of that, or not pigment. It will lift some of the pigment off, but you can lift some of that water off. Okay. So we've got a circle that's fairly desirable wetness. But let's say we're loading up this color and I've just like gotten super water heavy and I've loaded up a ton of water in this well of paint. Okay. Now I'm loading it up on my brush and I'm just going to get it super, see how it's like almost like there's like a water droplet about to fall off. So if our brush is too loaded, too saturated like that, then we're going to lose control of our bleeds too. So obviously if you want a big, big bleed and want to like put an eyeball or something like that, then go for it. But if it's too wet and like a small area, it will overwhelm your space, your workspace, okay? On the other end of that, we have a good level of wet for our wet in wet technique. But we come in, wow, getting sloppy. But we come in with a pretty dry brush. So this brush I haven't used in a minute, kind of dry. And I'm just gonna pick up some of this paint, but like where it's on the drier part of it. So it's not like super wet pigment, because this is all great and usable. This is what I was talking about earlier in the video when I'm saying we don't want to be afraid of water, right? So if you take just the pigment with not enough water to carry it, you're not really going to get the big bleeds and blends and bursts that you're looking for either. So gives you some control, because if you want bigger ones, and obviously then we can attain that by using that technique and loading our brush up. But if you want smaller little bursts, then just pigment on your brush with very minimal water is how you would attain those kind of results. So you can kind of see all of the things here as far as our wet and wet technique. So kind of like our desired approach: too wet on your paper, too dry on your paper, too wet on your brush, too dry on your brush. So those are kind of the common problems that I'm seeing in my classes, at least, with water control and issues with like the wet and wet technique, or just loading your brush in general. So there we have it, some tips and tricks for water control within your watercolor practice. Learning these key points about water control has really elevated my practice, and I hope it does the same for you. If you found this video useful and you would like to continue to see more watercolor tips, tricks, tutorials, all of the things, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment, tell me what you'd like to hear. I'm so excited to just share more and to get a little bit of insight into what you guys are wanting to learn. If you're in the Boise area, I do watercolor paint and sips around the valley. So be sure to check those out. Subscribe to my newsletter if you haven't already, and then you get the most up-to-date information on those releases. Tickets do sell pretty fast generally, so keep an eye out and subscribe. Anyways, thank you guys again for hanging out with me today, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!